You know, I've always considered windows as these sort of liminal spaces, which I think is the most interesting space to kind of focus on in art. You know, they're not really exterior, they're not really interior, they're this moment where things get a little blurred. They've been a recurring theme in my work for a really long time, but for this show in particular, I wanted to think about the idea of a window as this interim space between dreaming and reality. What does that look like? Like, what happens when you have this sort of film where the two worlds meet, and what happens with information when it moves through those spaces? The show started with looking at Vanessa Bell's still lifes, and in particular, her paintings of flowers. And when I saw those, that sort of prompted the first work for the show, which is called My Longing. And it also prompted this idea in my head of this line, portrait of myself as a flower. And that sort of expanded into ideas about dreaming as an act of resistance, and ideas of envisioning dreaming as a way to go beyond the body and to be more emotive and in tune with yourself, which I think is a really political act, especially right now. Drawing has always been a critical entry point for my work. It's the thing that I kind of always go to first. And I think the reason for that is because as humans, we go through the world and we're really bombarded with so much visual energy, and drawing is a way of distilling all that sort of chaotic information into its purest emotional form. So whether it's sculpture or painting or, you know, actually like physical drawing, my work always starts there, like paring it down to just a few lines to get at the core of something and then build back up from that. For this show, all the figures in the works are sort of turned inward, their eyes are closed or obscured, and there's this sort of refusal to engage with the viewer. And for me, part of the reason of doing that was when pairing it with the landscapes and the still lifes, it allowed their psyche to sort of expand out of the figures in the works and into the other works in the show. My mom had grown up really like in her early 20s, I think, discovering Bloomsbury and Charleston and fallen in love with them. And then in my early teens, one of her best friends had painted all of the kitchen cabinets to be like Charleston. And it was right around the same time that I was in a lot of punk houses, especially my boyfriend's house. Like his bedroom was covered like ceiling to floor with tags and cartoons and like little notes. At its most sort of like base, crass level, I think it's kind of like this act of rebellion or like kind of pushing back against authority, but on a more intimate level, it was about making the space his own and sort of dispelling loneliness, and that act of sort of being able to claim a space through expanding your interior onto the walls of the place you were living felt really powerful and radical. And I think because those two things happened at the same time, it sort of linked the idea of what happened at Charleston with Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant to that idea of being able to take the interior world and project it into a domestic space. When I first toured the space, I saw that across the street there's this really beautiful home that has this bird and vine sort of tangled curtain, and I fell in love with it. And I wanted to make a piece that was in response to it. So I, you know, took a blurry photo and redrew their drawing with the birds a little bit more frantic to be more reflective of my work. And then we worked with printers to create this sort of faux lace curtain. You know, if the show in a lot of ways is envisioning the body expanding outside of itself and being a landscape or a still life or even a home, you know, and that the idea of a house is this sort of body dreaming outwards to other spaces than to look across the street and see this curtain and bring it inside, to me, is a metaphor for the reason why I make work. At the core, being an artist is to pull something from your interior out into the world, and then to hope that there's other people it resonates with, and that they're then able to take their own bits and pull it into their interior world and make it their own thing. I visited Charleston, several times over the years, and I've always been really inspired by Quentin Bell's Levitating Woman. And I knew I wanted to make a piece in response to that. And I also knew that I wanted it to sort of reference Louise Bourgeois' arched figures. However, I think, with Quentin's, like, you're talking about a woman who isn't fully autonomous. She's under the control of the magician, or under the control of an external force. It was really important as a woman to make a work where there was a figure at peace with itself that didn't need anybody else, which I think is something that we rarely get to see as a reflection of ourselves. I think what I find most inspiring about Bell is the idea that domestic space can be radical, and that, if you look at a lot of art and literature, domestic space is really often seen as something that's confining for people, particularly for women. And there's this sense of her dreaming, within the community with all these other people, of a different sense of home. And that's really incredibly powerful. I've always been really moved by the sense that art wasn't this separate thing from her life, or a separate thing from the other Bloomsbury artists' lives, that it was sort of infused through everything that they did. And you're so much working towards shows as an artist, or you're working towards the next thing, but to really live in a way where it's a part of everything you do, I think is really inspiring and beautiful.